It's been pretty wild out there in the economic news lately,
Oh, yeah.
right? We're hearing all this talk about tariffs and like a serious market downturn,
Yeah.
maybe even a 20% crash
Hmm.
tied to all this uncertainty about trade. Makes you wonder, right? Like,
Absolutely.
are we heading for a major shift? And if so, how do we even deal with that?
Yeah. No, that feeling is it makes total sense, this sort of economic unease when trade policies are dominating the headlines.
Totally.
You're definitely not alone in wanting to get a good grip on what's actually happening and what the potential fallout could be.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we decided to deep dive into Douglas Irwin's book, Free Trade Under Fire.
Hmm.
It feels like, the perfect guidebook for navigating these kind of uncertain economic waters.
I think so too. It's a really great resource, really gets into the history and the theories behind international trade,
Right.
which is something I think people really need to understand now more than ever.
Especially right now. And so the big question we're wrestling with today, especially with this market volatility possibly tied to protectionist moves, is this. Does looking back at history and all these economic principles suggest that, putting up trade barriers is the best way to protect ourselves?
Right.
Or is free trade, sticking with free trade, still the better approach?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the key question that we're trying to grapple with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Irwin's book is packed with insight. I mean, it goes from centuries of trade history to the detailed arguments for and against trade policies. He even gets into like the role of these big international organizations and how trade affects developing countries. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Mm.
Our goal today is to just kind of break down those key issues for you so you can walk away feeling like you've got a solid understanding without getting too bogged down in all the details.
Right.
So maybe let's just start by unpacking the U.S.'s own journey with international trade.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. That's a good starting point. So, one of the things that Irwin's book really highlights is how much the U.S. has become connected to the global economy over time. Like, we see
Yeah.
this pretty significant rise in both the amount of goods that we export as a share of what we produce
Right.
and the total value of our trade compared to the size of our economy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just basic stuff anymore, right?
No.
Irwin points to this snapshot from 2013 that really jumped out at me,
Mm.
showing that, exports of other private services have been growing like crazy.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like education, financial services, technical expertise. It's interesting because despite all this worry about, American jobs going overseas, the U.S. was actually selling more of these services abroad than we were buying,
Right.
like legal services, computer programming, engineering know-how, all that.
Mm.
We actually had a trade surplus in these areas.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think it really challenges that sort of common narrative that we often hear about developed countries just kind of losing out in these higher skilled sectors.
Right. Like,
It really highlights the fact that the US still has this real competitive edge in a lot of advanced service industries.
totally. Yeah. Another thing that just like blew my mind was how much trade is actually happening between different parts of the same company.
Oh, yeah, that related party trade.
Yeah, yeah, that related party trade was a huge chunk of our imports and exports in 2013.
Mm,
And it really complicates the picture, right? Because it's not always this like clean exchange of finished goods between companies in different countries,
right,
like independent companies.
right. Yeah, it underscores the real complexity of, modern global supply
Yeah.
chains. A lot of these goods, they cross borders multiple times while they're actually being made. So, those simple interpretations of trade balances that we often hear, they can be pretty misleading.
Yeah, for sure. And then despite all this talk about globalization, it was actually surprising to read that more than 85% of what Americans consume is still made right here in the U.S.
Right.
That really puts things in perspective, right?
Right.
Because while international trade is definitely super important and it's growing, our economy is still largely based on what we produce domestically.
Yeah. And as Irwin points out, the world really isn't as fully integrated as we might think.
Yeah.
While our connections with each other are deeper than ever, our own domestic economic activity is still much larger than our international trade. And I think that's an important thing to remember as we start to think about, what could happen if we put up more trade barriers.
Totally. So we've seen that trade has become a bigger part of the U.S. economy.
Mm.
Now, I guess the question is, why do economists generally argue for free trade? Like, what's the economic case?
Well, the main idea is this concept of comparative advantage, which Ricardo famously explained back in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And it's not about which country is the best at making everything, can produce everything more efficiently.
Okay.
It's really about opportunity cost,
Yeah.
what a country gives up to produce something. So even if one country can produce two goods more efficiently than another country, it still makes sense for them to specialize in what they produce relatively more efficiently
Yeah.
and then trade for the other good.
Got it.
And that way, both countries end up with more than they could produce on their own.
So even if the U.S., for example, could technically make everything we need, it might still be smarter to focus on what we're really good at
Right.
and trade for other things.
Exactly. It frees up our resources to be more productive in those key areas where we have a comparative advantage.
Right. But I mean, the benefits go beyond just basic efficiency, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Irwin talks about a lot of other really important advantages. One is that trade gives both consumers and producers access to a much wider variety of goods.
Right.
And, for consumers, that obviously means more choices, potentially lower prices. But for businesses, it means that they can import all sorts of specialized components.
Hmm.
And that can lead to new products, more efficient manufacturing. He even gives examples of how countries like India and Korea saw innovation and productivity jump after they lowered tariffs on these kinds of inputs.
Yeah, it makes sense. If a U.S. company can get a specialized part from overseas that's better or cheaper, that can really help them improve their own products and compete more effectively, right?
Exactly. And then another benefit is just the higher quality of some imported goods.
Hmm.
Like Irwin gives the example of computer printers in India after import tariffs were removed, and consumers suddenly had access to much better machines.
Wow.
And then there are what John Stuart Mill called the indirect effects, these boosts to productivity that come from greater specialization of labor.
Hmm.
And, the sharing of knowledge and ideas that often happens with international trade.
So it's not just about getting cheaper goods. It's about becoming more efficient and innovative ourselves by engaging with the global marketplace.
Exactly. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that countries with more open trade policies tend to have higher per capita income.
Hmm.
Irwin points to a lot of studies, both looking at different countries and what happens within a country when it opens up to trade, and the general trend is pretty clear. More open trade is linked to greater prosperity. He even mentions studies showing, an average increase in growth rates after trade liberalization.
Okay, so that's a pretty compelling argument, I think, for sticking with free trade,
Right.
especially when we're thinking about long-term economic growth.
Right.
But what about the arguments against it? I mean, what are the costs when countries put up trade barriers like tariffs and quotas?
Yeah, this is where Irwin really highlights the downsides of protectionism.
Okay.
These policies, they distort prices, they create what economists call deadweight loss, which is basically a waste of resources. So when import restrictions artificially raise the price of a good, domestic companies produce more than they should.
Right.
But consumers buy less because it's more expensive.
Mm.
So the overall result is a loss for the economy.
And it's not just a small theoretical loss, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the book uses the U.S. sugar program as like a really clear example.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
Could you break that down?
Sure. So the U.S. sugar program basically uses import restrictions to keep the price of sugar in the U.S. much higher than it is on the world market. And this benefits American sugar producers to the tune of about $1 billion each year. But most of these benefits actually go to just a very small number of large farms. Meanwhile, American consumers end up paying an estimated $1.9 billion more for sugar.
Wow.
And so the net loss to the economy is something like $900 million. So consumers are paying almost twice as much extra as the producers are gaining.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how a small group gets a big benefit, but then a lot of people end up paying a little bit extra, and overall, the economy's worse off, right?
Exactly. And it creates a strong incentive for those who benefit to lobby for those protections, even if it hurts everyone else.
Right, totally. And Irwin really digs into some of the less visible aspects of this lobbying, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
He talks about the sugar program, of course, but he also gives this fascinating example of wire clothes hangers.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 2008, this single U.S. company lobbied successfully for high tariffs on Chinese imports of wire clothes hangers.
Right.
Their argument was that it wouldn't really cost consumers much, but it turned out to add up to about $120 million every year.
Wow.
And what was really astonishing, at least to me, was that the estimated cost per job saved in the U.S. wire hanger industry was over $212,000 per year.
Wow.
In an industry where the average worker was earning about $28,000.
Wow, that is incredible.
It's just wild. It really makes you think about, like, as a listener, like, who are these policies actually for?
Yeah, I think that's the key question.
Yeah,
I think it really highlights how concentrated benefits can drive lobbying efforts, even when the broader cost to consumers and the economy are much larger.
right.
And, Irwin also discusses this concept called the learner symmetry theorem,
Yep.
which basically says that policies that restrict imports also tend to hurt exports.
Huh.
And this is because when a country buys fewer imports, other countries have less of its currency to spend on its exports.
Okay.
So while import restrictions might save some jobs in some industries, they can lead to job losses in export-oriented industries.
Yeah.
He uses the example of Caterpillar, potentially selling fewer machines overseas if they have to pay more for domestic steel because of tariffs.
So tariffs on something like steel might help U.S. steel producers,
Right.
but could end up harming companies that use steel, like car manufacturers or construction companies,
Exactly.
potentially leading to job losses in those sectors.
Exactly. It's this domino effect.
Totally.
And, industries that use these inputs, they often fight against such tariffs. Irwin mentions a 40-to-1 coalition formed by steel-using industries who opposed steel tariffs, pointing out that they employ far more workers than the steel industry itself. Even General Motors warned that steel tariffs would make their U.S. operations less competitive.
So it's a really complex web of competing interests, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And then the political side of all this, making trade policy, must be just as complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Irwin talks about the political economy of trade, and he notes that in a pure democracy, what the average voter wants would likely be key. Because if free trade benefits the overall economy, but might hurt the average voter in a specific way, it could face opposition. And the skills of the workforce also plays a role. But in most countries, trade policy is made by elected officials. And, the economic interests in their districts and the rules of the political system, these things can greatly influence the outcome.
Totally.
And he also points out how certain groups might have better access to policymakers than others. And because of all these factors, it's hard to make broad statements about the politics of trade.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've looked at the economic case for free trade and the costs of protectionism, but there are arguments in favor of intervening in trade, right?
Oh, yeah.
What does Irwin say about those?
Yeah, he examines several common arguments. One is the terms of trade argument,
Okay.
which basically says that if a country is a major player in a particular market, like oil exporters, for example, then putting restrictions on trade could potentially increase their national income by improving the price that they get for their exports compared to what they pay for imports. However, Irwin points out that this generally doesn't apply to a large, diversified economy like the U.S.
So the U.S. economy is just too big and has too many different sectors to really be able to, like, manipulate global prices through tariffs in a way that would benefit us overall.
Yeah, that's the general understanding.
Yeah.
Another argument for intervention is to address market failures.
Right.
Like when there are positive side effects from an industry, like research and development that benefits other companies.
Right.
And so the theory is that, government intervention might be justified to encourage these beneficial spillovers. However, Irwin stresses how difficult it is in practice to accurately identify and fix these issues without causing other problems. He compares trying to support a specific industry with tariffs to trying to do, very delicate work with a very clumsy tool.
Right.
And he also highlights how in the U.S., trade policy is often influenced by lawyers advocating for specific industries,
Okay.
which can lead to policies that benefit those industries at the expense of the broader economy.
It sounds like it's just really hard to be objective when you've got those specific groups pushing for intervention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about the idea of strategic trade policy?
Yeah.
Where governments try to help domestic companies, like in important high-tech industries, to kind of become global leaders.
Yeah, this idea gained some traction in the 1980s.
Okay.
The thought is that, government support, like subsidies, could help shift profits from foreign companies to domestic ones in these key industries.
Okay.
And the example that's often given is European governments supporting Airbus to compete with Boeing. However, Irwin talks about a lot of problems with this idea, both in theory and in practice.
Right.
To make these policies work, governments would need like incredibly detailed knowledge of market conditions.
Hmm.
And even small mistakes could have negative results. And economic models suggest that any potential gains are often very small, while the risks and costs of mismanaging these interventions are high.
It sounds like these arguments for intervening in trade, they sound a lot more appealing in theory than they are in practice.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, especially for a complex economy like the US.
Totally. So I guess now let's talk about, a big one, a really important, often debated topic,
Hmm.
trade deficits and jobs.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about how when we import more than we export, it costs American jobs. What does Irwin say about this connection?
Well, he clarifies that, while imports can lead to job losses in industries that compete with those imports,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily mean that trade reduces the overall number of jobs in the economy or harms the economy as a whole.
Okay.
He gives historical examples like the shoe industry in Maine or textiles in South Carolina. He points out that technological advancements, they also cause job displacement, but we don't generally see technological progress as a bad thing.
Hmm.
And, blocking imports might protect some jobs in some sectors, but it can also lead to job losses in other sectors, by lowering exports and increasing costs for companies that use imported goods.
So it's more about jobs shifting from one sector to another rather than a net loss of jobs for the whole economy.
Right. I mean, more accurately, trade creates jobs in export-oriented industries and in industries that use imported components, even as it leads to job losses in those import-competing industries.
Right.
And, the U.S. Department of Commerce estimated that exports of goods and services supported over 11 million American jobs in 2013, both directly and indirectly.
Wow.
So, the focus should really be on promoting a productive and adaptable workforce rather than just trying to preserve jobs in less competitive sectors.
So thinking back to NAFTA, there was all this talk about, massive job losses.
Yeah, exactly.
What does Irwin say about that?
Well, he uses the NAFTA debate as a prime example of how claims about job losses from trade agreements can be, really exaggerated. That famous prediction of a giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico never actually happened. In fact, overall employment in the U.S. increased significantly after NAFTA went into effect.
Hmm.
So while some workers undoubtedly were displaced because of increased competition, the actual impact was small. Similarly, claims of huge job gains from NAFTA were likely overstated.
Right.
And a lot of these were based on, pretty simple calculations of jobs per dollar of exports, which aren't always accurate.
So it sounds like trade agreements probably have a much smaller impact on overall employment levels than is often portrayed in, political discussions.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
So then what are the things that actually drive employment levels in an economy?
Well, Irwin really emphasizes that a country's overall level of employment is primarily determined by macroeconomic factors,
Okay.
like government spending, interest rates, and by the dynamics of the labor market itself, not by trade policy.
Okay.
He also discusses the decline in manufacturing employment in the U.S., and he attributes it largely to big increases in productivity in the manufacturing sector and a shift in consumer demand towards services. And this is a trend that we see in most developed countries.
That makes sense, right? Like we're producing more goods with fewer people and manufacturing,
Right.
and we're just spending more money on things like healthcare, education, entertainment.
What about this concern about trade with countries that have lower wages?
Yeah.
Like, is that putting downward pressure on wages in the U.S.?
Well, Irwin notes that, high wages in the U.S. are fundamentally based on the high productivity of American workers.
Right.
There's been a lot of concern about this race to the bottom in wages because of trade with these lower wage countries.
Hmm.
But, the evidence actually suggests that trade with low wage countries has had a relatively small impact on overall wage inequality in the U.S. Like likely accounting for less than 10% of the increase in the wage gap between college-educated and non-college educated workers between 1980 and 2006.
Hmm.
And he also points out that, the timing of the increase in wage inequality doesn't perfectly match up with when imports from low-wage countries really took off.
So it's not as simple as some people make it seem.
No, not at all.
But what about the workers, though, who do lose their jobs?
Because of trade, right. I mean, they're often facing real hardship.
Yeah, absolutely. Irwin acknowledges those significant and long-lasting earnings losses that can happen to workers who are displaced because of trade. And, the longer someone's been in their previous job, the greater that potential
All
loss.
right.
He discusses government programs like Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA,
Hmm.
which is aimed at helping these workers.
Right.
And while there's general agreement that, unemployed workers should get some support, there's debate about whether those displaced by trade deserve more assistance than those who lose their jobs for other reasons.
Mhm.
And he mentions a pilot program called Alternative Trade Adjustment Assistance, or ATAA,
Okay.
which includes wage insurance, as a potentially more effective approach because it encourages reemployment by partially compensating for wage differences when a worker takes a lower paying job.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so let's finally talk about trade deficits. What's Irwin's key takeaway there?
Well, he explains that a trade deficit is primarily a macroeconomic phenomenon related to the overall flow of money in and out of a country.
Okay.
So when a country imports more than it exports, the money that's spent on those imports actually eventually comes back into the country, often as investment in assets like stocks, bonds, or real estate.
Hmm.
So, in a sense, when Americans buy more goods from abroad than foreigners buy from us, the difference comes back as foreign residents investing in the U.S.
Right.
And he mentions factors like, a global savings glut and China's currency policy as influencing the U.S. trade deficit.
Okay.
But, the crucial point is that trade policy alone has a limited impact on the overall trade deficit.
So just using tariffs to try to shrink the trade deficit is probably not going to be very effective because
Right.
it doesn't actually address the underlying macroeconomic factors.
Exactly.
Okay. I guess now let's shift our focus to the rules that govern global trade, like the World Trading System, the WTO, all these regional trade agreements. How did this all develop?
Well, Irwin traces it all the way back to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which was established after World War II.
Hmm.
And GATT laid out some fundamental principles for trade policy, most notably the most favored nation, or MFN principle, which basically requires countries to give all GATT members the same trade treatment.
Right.
JT went through several rounds of negotiations, like the Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, and the Uruguay round. And each of these led to, further reductions in tariffs
Right.
and expanded the scope of trade rules. And the Uruguay round was particularly important because it led to the creation of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 1994, which has a much stronger system for resolving trade disputes.
So the WTO is essentially GATT's successor, but with more teeth to enforce the rules.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. While GATT had a dispute settlement process, the WTO's is more formal and binding. However, Irwin also points out that the WTO's authority is ultimately limited. It can't actually force countries to negotiate or to comply with its rulings. Right.
But the potential for retaliation from other member countries, that does provide a pretty strong incentive to follow the rules.
Yeah.
We've also seen a big increase in the number of regional trade agreements in recent years.
Yeah.
And, Irwin actually has this really interesting chart in the book that shows this trend.
Okay.
And these agreements, like NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, they involve preferential trade arrangements between a smaller group of countries,
Oh.
meaning they offer each other better trade terms than they do to other WTO members.
Right.
And, they're allowed under WTO rules, but there's this ongoing debate about whether these regional agreements are helping to pave the way for broader global trade liberalization,
Okay.
or whether they're creating separate trade blocs that might actually hinder global trade liberalization.
So it sounds like there are valid arguments on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Like some people hope that these regional agreements can lead to wider agreements eventually.
But others worry that they might actually undermine the global system.
Exactly. Irwin notes that this idea of open regionalism, where any country can join a trade agreement, that doesn't seem to work very well in practice.
Okay.
And the evidence on whether these agreements ultimately help or hurt global trade is mixed.
Yeah.
Some studies suggest that they might make countries less willing to reduce tariffs in these broader multilateral trade negotiations on goods that are heavily traded within the regional blocs.
Right, that makes sense. What about some of the controversies surrounding these trade agreements? Like the investor-state dispute settlement provision.
Oh, yeah. Irwin talks about these a bit. He explains that these clauses allow foreign investors to sue host governments in international arbitration tribunals
Mm.
if they believe the government has violated the terms of an investment agreement.
Okay.
And the idea behind them is to attract foreign investment by providing this kind of extra layer of projection. However, critics argue that this can allow corporations to challenge legitimate government regulations like environmental rules or health rules
Mm.
in a way that's not transparent and might undermine democratic processes. But
Mm.
then proponents argue that, governments agreed to these provisions to signal their commitment to fair treatment of foreign investment.
Right, so both sides have their points.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, Irwin dedicates a whole chapter to the relationship between trade and developing countries.
Yeah.
What are the main takeaways there?
Well, he presents a generally positive view, highlighting the really significant impact that trade has had on a lot of developing economies.
Hmm.
He talks about these globalizers, which are developing countries that have substantially increased their participation in international trade since 1980.
Okay.
And he points out that they've experienced much higher rates of per capita income growth compared to countries that stayed less open to trade.
Oh.
He gives examples like Vietnam versus Myanmar, formerly Burma, where greater openness has led to much better economic outcomes. And then, of course, the experiences of China and India with these dramatic reductions in poverty following trade liberalization are also very significant.
So for a lot of developing countries, opening up to international trade has been a powerful engine for economic growth
Absolutely.
and for lifting people out of poverty.
Yeah.
But, Irwin is careful to point out that trade liberalization alone isn't a magic solution.
Right.
Like, there are other factors that matter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Things like stable macroeconomic policies and the rule of law.
Mm.
Those are also crucial.
Right.
He also addresses concerns about labor standards in these developing countries.
Right.
Like the whole issue of sweatshops. And he argues that, foreign investment often provides wages that are higher than average compared to local alternatives.
Yeah.
And that restricting trade could actually be counterproductive, potentially reducing the limited job opportunities available to workers in those countries.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a complex issue.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, there are legitimate concerns about working conditions, but limiting trade might actually make things worse for these workers by reducing their options.
Exactly. And he also highlights the inconsistency of developed countries maintaining, these high trade barriers in sectors where developing countries have a comparative advantage, like agriculture and labor-intensive manufacturing.
Okay.
These barriers, along with agricultural subsidies in these wealthy nations, can actually significantly hurt the economies of developing countries.
So creating a more level playing field in global trade would be particularly beneficial for those developing nations.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key conclusions from Irwin's analysis.
Okay, so as we come back to our initial question, right, with the possibility of this economic uncertainty and all this talk about protectionism looming, does Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire offer us a lifeline? Or is it more of a warning, with this potential market crash linked to tariffs? Is protectionism a viable way to kind of survive this? Or is sticking with free trade still the answer?
Well, the book really strongly argues that free trade is the more beneficial path.
Okay.
Irwin really meticulously lays out, the historical evidence for economic growth fueled by trade, the inherent inefficiencies and often hidden costs of these protectionist policies, the
Right.
complex realities of trade deficits, and the overall positive role of a rules-based international trading system in fostering global prosperity.
Right, and he also includes developing countries in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so while he does advocate for free trade, he's not ignoring the downsides either, right? Or the need for domestic policies to help those who might be negatively impacted by trade.
No, that's right. He presents, a pretty balanced perspective, acknowledging that trade can lead to job displacement and wage adjustments in certain sectors. He emphasizes the importance of having, these effective domestic policies in place, things like strong social safety nets and job retraining programs to support those workers.
Right.
But his overall conclusion is that resorting to protectionism is not a sustainable solution and is likely to cause more significant economic harm in the long run.
So the book kind of serves as a warning, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Against this temptation of protectionism when times are tough, reminding us of its historical failures and those fundamental economic principles that really favor open trade.
Exactly. While, the appeal of protectionism might be strong when markets are volatile, the evidence strongly suggests that it's a risky path and one that ultimately undermines economic well-being.
Okay, so taking into account all the evidence that Irwin presents, the historical growth driven by trade, the cost of protectionism, the complexities of trade deficits, and the benefits of a global trading system, here's a thought for you as a listener. In a world that's as interconnected as ours, facing all these economic headwinds, what do you think are the most critical things to focus on to ensure stability and growth? Is it about building up more trade barriers? Or is it about strengthening our own domestic economic foundations? And then what role should international cooperation play in helping us navigate these kind of uncertain times? Definitely something to think about. Maybe now's a good time to check out Douglas Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire for yourself and really explore these arguments in more detail. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.